The bitter cold of December 1944 cut through Private Michael Collins' worn combat jacket as he huddled in his foxhole outside Bastogne. The wind carried the distant thunder of German artillery, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past weeks. His fingers, numb despite the gloves, tightened around his M1 Garand as he watched the tree line through the pre-dawn darkness. The 101st Airborne Division had been holding this position for what felt like an eternity, though his pocket calendar told him it had only been 5 days. The Ardennes forest stretched out before them, its snow-covered branches concealing whatever horrors the Wehrmacht had in store. Intelligence suggested that German forces were massing for a major offensive, but in the field, intelligence was about as reliable as the winter weather. The first shell landed without warning, its shriek cutting through the morning stillness like a banshee's wail. Collins pressed himself deeper into his foxhole as the explosion sent dirt and snow cascading over him. The barrage that followed was unlike anything he'd experienced before, methodical, precise, as if the German artillery crews had spent days plotting every coordinate. "Collins, get your ass up here." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Parker, barely audible over the continuing bombardment. Collins scrambled out of his position, keeping low as he ran in a crouch toward the command post, little more than a deeper foxhole with a canvas cover. He found Parker hunched over a map, his face illuminated by a dimmed flashlight. The lieutenant's features were drawn tight, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something Collins had never seen before: fear. "We've got orders to fall back," Parker said without looking up. German armor broke through the lines to the north. "We're about to be surrounded if we don't move now." He finally raised his eyes to meet Collins's. "Get to the western positions. Tell everyone to prep for immediate withdrawal. We're pulling back to the secondary defense line." Collins nodded and turned to go, but Parker grabbed his arm. "And Collins, make it quiet. We've got reports of German patrols between us and our fallback position. Last thing we need is to start a firefight while we're trying to withdraw." The artillery had slackened, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. As Collins moved through their lines, passing the order to withdraw, he heard something that made his blood run cold. German voices, far too close, speaking in hushed tones. He was nearly finished with his task when he found them. 3 men from 2nd Platoon, caught in the initial barrage. Private Thomas Miller had taken shrapnel to both legs, the bleeding barely controlled by hastily applied bandages. Corporal Frank Davidson's arm was mangled, bone visible through torn flesh. The 3rd, Private William Hayes, had taken a hit to his abdomen, the worst kind of wound a soldier could get in the field. "Thank God," Miller whispered when he saw Collins. "We've been trying to radio for help. Comms are dead." Collins felt his stomach twist as he looked at the 3 men. They'd need stretchers at minimum, probably medical evacuation. They had neither. The sounds of German patrol movements were getting closer and their position was rapidly becoming untenable. A massive explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky to their east. Through the trees, Collins could see the orange glow of burning vehicles. The Germans were making their push, and they were caught in the middle. Lieutenant Parker's voice suddenly crackled over Collins' radio, breaking through the static. "All units, fall back, now. Multiple German columns advancing on our pass." The transmission cut off in a burst of static, followed by the distinctive sound of an MG-42 machine gun. Collins looked at the wounded men, then back toward the sound of advancing German forces. In that moment, he realized that Lieutenant Parker's last order would never be completed, because now he had to make a choice that no training had prepared him for. The dark woods seemed to close in around them as the sound of German voices grew closer and the weight of command settled onto Collins's shoulders like a lead blanket. The news of Lieutenant Parker's death came via Private Henderson, who appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, his face streaked with blood and dirt. "Lieutenant's gone," he gasped, doubled over and trying to catch his breath. Took a burst from a machine gun. Rest of command staff too. Tank round. Hit the CP direct. Collins felt the world tilt slightly. As a private first class, he'd never expected to be in command of anything larger than his own foxhole. Now, by virtue of being the highest-ranking survivor in their immediate vicinity, he was responsible for the lives of everyone around him. A quick assessment of their situation made his head spin. They had 3 severely wounded men who couldn't walk under their own power. The only vehicle they had access to was a damaged Dodge WC-54 ambulance, its front end crumpled from a near-miss artillery strike. The engine still ran, but it was designed to carry 4 stretcher cases at most, and they had nearly twice that many able-bodied men to transport as well. "What are our orders, sir?" Henderson asked, and Collins nearly looked behind himself to see who Henderson was addressing before realizing the question was meant for him. The "sir" felt wrong. He wasn't an officer, had never wanted to be one, but right now, that didn't matter. "How many men do we have?" Collins asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. 8 Mobile, including you and me," Henderson reported, "plus these 3 wounded. We've got maybe 200 rounds, a few grenades, and whatever's in the aid station supplies. Radio's dead. Caught a piece of shrapnel through the main unit." Collins nodded, processing the information. He could hear the rumble of German vehicles getting closer, the sound of tank treads crushing fallen trees. The wounded men looked up at him with desperate hope in their eyes, and he felt the weight of their lives pressing down on him. "What about morphine?" he asked, thinking of the wounded men's pain. Henderson shook his head. "Used the last of it on Hayes. Aid station got hit early in the barrage. Most of our medical supplies were destroyed." Private Miller groaned from his position on the ground, his leg wounds seeping through the makeshift bandages. "Just don't leave us for those bastards," he managed through gritted teeth. "We all heard about Malmedy." The Malmedy massacre was fresh in everyone's minds. American prisoners gunned down in cold blood by SS troops just days earlier. The thought of their own men facing the same fate sent a chill through Collins that had nothing to do with the winter air. "We need to move," Henderson urged. "Those German patrols are getting closer, and I heard tracks. They've got armor support." Collins closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command crushing down on him. Every second they delayed increased the chance of discovery, but every step they took would be agony for the wounded men. He knew what an officer would do in this situation, knew what the manual said about tactical withdrawals and acceptable losses, but he wasn't an officer, and these weren't just soldiers under his command. They were his friends. The sound of German voices grew closer, accompanied by the mechanical growl of a panzer. They were running out of time, and Collins knew he would have to live with whatever decision he made in the next few moments, assuming he lived at all. Private Henderson wasn't the only one who managed to salvage something from the command post. Joey Romano, their radio man, had grabbed the backup receiver before the German tanks reduced their position to splinters. Now, hunched behind the damaged ambulance, he frantically worked the dials, trying to pick up any Allied transmissions. "Got something," Romano whispered, his face pale in the dim light, "but it's not ours." Collins pressed the headphones to his ear, and his blood ran cold. The German transmissions were clear, unnaturally so given the weather and distance. The voice on the other end was calm, methodical, discussing the disposal of captured American soldiers as casually as if they were talking about the weather. "They're hunting survivors," Romano translated, his voice shaking. "Systematic sweep pattern. He paused, swallowing hard. "They're under orders to take no prisoners." Collins handed the headphones back, his mind racing. The Germans weren't just advancing, they were cleaning house, making sure no Allied soldiers survived to report their movements. The Malmedy massacre hadn't been an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. "There's more," Henderson said, returning from a quick recon of the area. "Found a farmhouse about half a click east. Recent signs of occupation." He hesitated, his face grim. "It's bad, Collins, real bad." Despite the urgency of their situation, Collins knew he needed to see it for himself. Leaving Romano to monitor the radio and the others to watch the wounded, he followed Henderson through the snow-covered forest to a small Belgian farmhouse. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the cold wind. Inside, Collins found evidence of what Henderson had called bad. The family, father, mother, and what looked like 3 children hadn't just been killed. They'd been executed, systematically, presumably for helping Allied soldiers. The father's hands were still bound with wire, and a half-written note in English lay on the kitchen table, never completed. "Found these 2, Henderson said quietly, holding up a set of American dog tags. "Looks like some of our boys tried to hide here. Didn't end well for anyone." Collins stepped back outside, the crisp winter air doing nothing to clear the horror from his mind. In the distance, he could hear the wounded men's muffled groans carrying through the trees. Every sound felt like it could carry for miles in the frozen air, potentially drawing their hunters right to them. A new sound cut through the night. The distinctive bark of German shepherds. The SS weren't just hunting with tanks and men, they were using dogs to track survivors through the snow. "How long?" Collins asked. Henderson shook his head. "Maybe an hour, probably less. Dogs'll move faster than the tanks through these woods." Back at their position, the situation had deteriorated further. Hayes, the soldier with the abdominal wound, had developed a fever, his skin burning hot despite the freezing temperature. His delirious mumbling threatened to give away their position with every passing minute. "We need to decide," Romano said, still monitoring the radio. "Wehrmacht units might take prisoners, but I'm picking up SS communications. Death's Head units, they're the ones coming our way." The SS Totenkopfverbände. The Death's Head units were the worst of the worst. They operated the concentration camps, conducted reprisal killings, and had a reputation for brutality that made even regular German soldiers uncomfortable. If they were the ones hunting survivors, capture wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. Miller, still conscious despite his leg wounds, grabbed Collins's sleeve. "Remember Sergeant Patterson's story?" he asked through gritted teeth. "About what the SS did to his unit when they got captured back in France. Don't let that happen, not to us." Collins remembered. Patterson had been the only survivor of his unit's capture by the SS. What he'd described happening to his fellow soldiers still gave Collins nightmares. The thought of these men, his friends, suffering the same fate was unbearable. But so was the thought of leaving them behind. The dogs barked again, closer now. Through the trees, Collins caught glimpses of flashlight beams sweeping the forest floor. The hunters were getting closer, and time was running out. They moved through the night like ghosts, the damaged ambulance's engine muffled as much as possible. Collins had made the decision to try for the nearby Belgian village of Noville, hoping to find medical supplies, or at least better shelter than the frozen forest. The wounded men bit down on leather belts to keep from crying out as every bump and turn sent waves of pain through their injuries. The village appeared through the swirling snow like something from a nightmare. No lights burned in any window, no smoke rose from any chimney, though the temperature had dropped well below freezing. The empty streets were covered in a fresh layer of snow, unmarked by vehicle tracks or footprints, a detail that made Collins's combat-honed instinct scream in warning. "Something's wrong," Henderson whispered as they rolled to a stop at the village's edge. "Town this size should have people, refugees at least." Collins nodded, motioning for 2 of his able-bodied men to scout ahead. They returned 10 minutes later, their faces ashen. "They're all dead," Private Wilson reported, his voice shaking. "Whole town. Must be at least 100 civilians. He paused, swallowing hard. "They tried to hide in the church. SS found them." The reality of what they'd stumbled into became clear as they moved deeper into the village. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, men, women, children. Some had been shot trying to run, others executed against walls. The snow beneath them had long since turned from red to brown, telling Collins this had happened at least a day ago. "Why?" Romano asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They were just civilians." "Message to the resistance," Henderson replied grimly. "Town probably helped some Allied soldiers. This was their punishment." They found the church at the center of town, its ancient stone walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Inside, the scale of the atrocity became fully apparent. The townspeople had indeed tried to shelter there, perhaps believing even the SS wouldn't violate the sanctity of a house of God. They'd been wrong. "We can't stay here," Collins said, forcing himself to focus on their survival. "This'll be one of the first places they check when they sweep through." But as they turned to leave, Hayes' condition took a turn for the worse. The wound in his abdomen had become infected, spreading poison through his body. His fever spiked, and the delirious soldier began calling out for his mother, his voice echoing off the church's stone walls. "Shut him up," Henderson hissed, but it was too late. In the distance, they heard the dogs bark in response. The gap between their group and their pursuers had been slowly closing, the SS units moving faster through familiar territory, while Collins's group was slowed by their wounded. Now, that gap was about to close entirely. They got Hayes back into the ambulance, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The other wounded men weren't faring much better. Miller's leg wounds had begun showing signs of infection, and Davidson's mangled arm had swollen to twice its normal size. "How far to Allied lines?" Collins asked Romano, who had been monitoring the radio. "Maybe 10 miles, the radio man replied, but he hesitated, listening to the German transmissions. "They're between us and friendly forces. At least 2 Panzer units and several SS companies. They're establishing a solid line." The sound of vehicle engines carried through the frozen air. German half-tracks moving along the main road. The SS were spreading out, preparing to sweep the town just as they'd swept the forest. Collins looked at his men, seeing the exhaustion and fear in their faces. They'd been moving for hours, carrying their wounded comrades, watching behind them for pursuit. The cold had seeped into their bones and their ammunition was running dangerously low. More importantly, he saw the growing realization in their eyes, the same terrible understanding that was forming in his own mind. They couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. Hayes let out another delirious cry, this one louder than before. In response, the German shepherds barked again, closer now, much closer. Night had fully settled over Noville, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed to freeze the very air in their lungs. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and their breath came out in white clouds that hung suspended in the stillness. The moon cast an eerie glow over the snow-covered village, creating long shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping fingers. Through the damaged window of an abandoned house, Collins watched as the first SS patrol entered the village. Their black uniforms made them look like shadows themselves, moving with practiced precision through the empty streets. The skull insignias on their collars gleamed dully in the moonlight, death's heads hunting in the darkness. The German shepherds moved ahead of their handlers, noses to the ground, following the trail that Collins and his men had left. Despite their best efforts to avoid leaving tracks, the dogs would eventually lead their hunters right to them. "They're setting up a perimeter," Henderson whispered, joining Collins at the window. "Standard SS tactical doctrine, seal all exits, then sweep inward. They know we're here." In the next room, Hayes' condition had deteriorated further. The infection from his abdominal wound had spread, causing his fever to spike dangerously high. His skin burned to the touch, and his delirious mumblings had given way to occasional screams that they could barely muffle in time. "He won't last the night," Romano said quietly, checking Hayes' bandages. The wound had turned an angry red, with dark lines spreading outward across his skin, gangrene setting in, without proper medical attention. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what gangrene meant in the field. Miller and Davidson weren't faring much better. The cold had actually helped slow the bleeding from Miller's leg wounds, but the price was a creeping numbness that worried Collins deeply. Frostbite in a wounded limb was practically a death sentence. Davidson's mangled arm had swollen so badly that they'd had to cut away his sleeve, and the exposure to the cold was taking its toll. Through the radio, they could hear the SS commanders coordinating their search. Romano's face grew paler with each transmission he translated. "They're bringing in more units," he reported. 3 more SS companies, plus Wehrmacht support. "They're treating this like a major operation." He swallowed hard. "They're talking about using flamethrowers to clear buildings they consider suspicious." A scream cut through the night, not from Hayes this time, but from somewhere else in the village. It was quickly silenced by a burst of gunfire. The SS had found someone else trying to hide. "That'll be the Van Housen family," a voice said from the shadows. They all spun, weapons raised, to find an elderly Belgian man watching them from a concealed cellar entrance. He raised his hands slowly. "Peace, Americans. I am Matthias. I help when I can." The old man's face was gaunt, his eyes haunted. "The Van Housens helped some American soldiers last week. They've been hiding ever since. But the SS, they always find who they're looking for. Eventually." Matthias moved closer, glancing at their wounded. His expression grew even grimmer. "Your men, they will not survive long without medical care. And the SS, they are very thorough in their searches. They will find you just as they found the others." "Is there another way out of the village?" Collins asked. "Something the Germans might not know about." The old Belgian nodded slowly. "There is an old mining tunnel from before the Great War. It comes up in the forest 2 kilometers east. But..." He looked at their wounded men, his meaning clear. The tunnel would be no place for men in their condition. Another scream echoed through the night, followed by more gunfire. The dogs barked excitedly, and Collins could hear German voices growing closer. Hayes chose that moment to cry out again, his fever-racked body convulsing. The sound carried clearly through the thin walls of the house. Almost immediately they heard the dogs change direction. "They heard him," Henderson said, his voice tight. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they reach us." Collins felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force. The time for difficult decisions had run out. Now, only impossible ones remained. The dog's barking grew closer as Collins stared at his wounded men. Hayes had finally fallen silent, his fever-induced delirium giving way to an unsettling stillness. Miller clutched his rosary with trembling fingers, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. Davidson's eyes met Collins's, and in them he saw understanding and resignation. "You need to go," Davidson said quietly, his voice barely audible over the approaching German voices. "We all know it. We've known it since the farmhouse." "No," Collins replied automatically, but the word felt hollow even as he said it. "We don't leave our people behind." "Sometimes," the old Belgian Matthias said softly, "leaving them behind is the only way to ensure anyone survives to tell their story." He moved to the cellar entrance. "The tunnel awaits, but you must decide quickly. The SS will show no mercy to anyone they find." The sounds of systematic building searches carried through the night, doors being kicked in, furniture overturned, occasional bursts of gunfire followed by silence. The hunters were drawing their net tight around the village. "Our supplies are gone," Romano reported, checking their inventory one final time. 2 magazines per man, 3 grenades total. No more morphine, no antibiotics. He looked at Hayes. "Even if we could move them, they wouldn't survive the journey." Collins knelt beside Miller, whose leg wounds had begun to show the telltale signs of serious infection. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "Tell me. This has to be your choice too." Miller managed a weak smile. "You know what needs to happen, sir." The sir wasn't protocol this time, it was respect. "Just make sure you tell my mom I wasn't afraid at the end, even if it ain't true." Davidson nodded in agreement. "Same for me, tell them we went down fighting." Hayes stirred briefly, his eyes focusing for the first time in hours. "Don't let them take us alive," he whispered. "You heard what they did to the others, promise me." The weight of their request settled onto Collins' shoulders like a physical burden. He understood what they were really asking, what mercy meant in this situation. The SS's reputation for brutality toward captured soldiers, especially wounded ones, was well known. 5 grenades, Davidson said, pulling previously hidden explosives from his jacket. Saved them, figured they might be needed. His eyes met Collins. 1 for each of us, and 2 for whoever comes through that door first. Henderson appeared at the window. "They're 3 buildings away," he reported, moving methodically, checking everything. "Dogs are leading them right to us." Collins looked at his remaining able-bodied men, Henderson, Romano, Wilson, and 3 others. Young men, all of them, with families waiting back home. Men who might survive if they moved now, but would certainly die if they stayed. "The tunnel," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Matthias, show us." The old Belgian nodded and moved to the cellar entrance. The able-bodied men began to move, but Collins raised his hand. "Wait," he said. He took off his jacket and gave it to Miller, whose shivering had grown worse. "You'll need this more than me." He distributed what remained of their ammunition and medical supplies to the wounded men. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then he knelt beside each of them, sharing a final moment that no training had prepared him for. "If they come through that door," Davidson began. "They won't take you alive," Collins promised. "You'll have your grenades. You'll go out on your own terms." The dogs were very close now. They could hear German voices giving commands, coordinating their search pattern. "Go," Hayes whispered. "Tell them what happened here, all of it. Make sure people know." Collins nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He looked one last time at his wounded men, his friends, memorizing their faces, knowing he would see them in his dreams for the rest of his life. Then he turned and followed Matthias into the cellar, toward the tunnel that promised escape. Behind him, he heard Miller begin to pray again, and Davidson checking the pins on his grenades. The hard choice had been made. Now they had to live with it, those who would live at all. The mining tunnel was barely high enough to stand in, its ancient timber supports groaning under the weight of earth above them. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and their footsteps echoed despite their attempts at silence. Matthias led them by memory alone, his knowledge of these passages their only hope of survival. Behind them, muffled by earth and distance, they heard the sound they'd been dreading, the sharp crack of grenades, followed by German shouts and gunfire. Then silence. Collins stopped for a moment, leaning against the tunnel wall, the reality of what had just happened hitting him like a physical blow. "They died as soldiers," Henderson said quietly, placing a hand on Collins' shoulder. "They chose their end." But Collins knew the truth. They hadn't chosen anything. The choices had been made for them by war, by circumstance, by the cruelty of men wearing death's head insignias. The grenades had been mercy, not choice. "The tunnel branches ahead," Matthias whispered, his voice barely audible. "Left fork leads to the old quarry. Right fork comes up in the forest, but..." He hesitated. "The right fork collapsed partially last winter. We must crawl through a narrow space." They chose the right fork, knowing the quarry would be too exposed. The collapsed section was worse than Matthias had described, a space barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, filled with loose soil and the constant threat of further collapse. As they crawled through one by one, Collins heard Romano quietly weeping. The radio man had been monitoring German communications until the end, had heard the SS troops breach the building where they'd left their wounded. He knew exactly what had happened after those final grenades. Once through the collapse, they moved as quickly as they dared. The sound of dogs barking could be heard even through the earth above them. The SS were expanding their search pattern, knowing that some of the Americans had escaped. "Your friends," Matthias said as they walked. "They bought you time. The Germans will spend hours searching that building, looking for documents, information. They will not believe all the Americans were there, but by then you will be gone." "Will they hurt you for helping us?" Collins asked. The old Belgian smiled sadly. "I am too old to fear what men can do to me. I have seen 2 wars, lost 2 families. What remains is only duty to help when I can, while I can." They emerged from the tunnel into a forest thick with new fallen snow. The moon had set, leaving them in near total darkness. In the distance they could see the glow of fires in Noville, the SS making good on their threat to burn suspicious buildings. "Head northeast," Matthias instructed. 3 kilometers to the river. The ice should hold your weight if you spread out. German patrols stay away from the river at night, too exposed to Allied aircraft. Collins reached out to shake the old man's hand. "Thank you. If we survive this..." "No thanks needed. Just remember all of it. The good and the bad, the choices and the prices paid." Matthias turned to go, then stopped. "Your wounded friends, they were brave men. Make sure their sacrifice means something." They watched the Belgian disappear back into the tunnel before starting their journey. The snow was deep, each step requiring significant effort, but they pushed on. No one spoke. What could be said after what they'd just experienced? Romano had kept the radio, though its usefulness was questionable now. As they walked, it occasionally crackled with German transmissions, reports of bodies found, orders for wider search patterns, coordinates for artillery strikes. Each message was another weight added to their shoulders, another reminder of what they'd left behind. Wilson stumbled in the snow, and Collins helped him up. The young private's face was streaked with frozen tears. "I can't stop seeing their faces," Wilson whispered. "Hayes, Miller, Davidson. They trusted us, trusted you, and we left them." "We didn't leave them," Henderson said firmly. "We honored their choice, their sacrifice. There's a difference." But Collins wasn't sure there was a difference, not really. In the end, the results were the same. Good men dead in a frozen Belgian village, their bodies to be buried in unmarked graves or left to burn in buildings set aflame by SS troops. The sound of distant artillery brought them back to their immediate situation. The Germans were shelling suspected escape routes, trying to catch any fleeing soldiers in their barrage. They needed to move faster, but exhaustion was taking its toll. Each step away from Noville felt like both an escape and a betrayal. They were alive, but at what cost? The price of survival was proving to be higher than any of them had imagined, and Collins knew they would be paying it for the rest of their lives. Dawn broke over the Ardennes with cruel indifference, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Collins and his remaining men had reached the American lines just as first light crept over the horizon. Their approach met with raised rifles and suspicious challenges until their identities were confirmed. They were immediately taken to the command post of the 502nd Infantry Regiment, where the debriefing began. Collins sat in a wooden chair, a cup of coffee growing cold in his trembling hands as he recounted the events of the past 24 hours. The commanding officer, a Major Harrison, listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "We've had other reports," the major said when Collins finished. "Similar stories from different sectors. Entire units wiped out, wounded men executed, civilians murdered." He pulled out a map marked with red circles. Each circle represents a confirmed massacre site. "Your report from Noville adds another one." Romano, still clutching his radio, spoke up. "Sir, I recorded some of the German transmissions. They were systematic about it, coordinated. This wasn't random brutality, it was policy." The major nodded slowly. "Intelligence suggests it's coming from the top. Orders to show no mercy, take no prisoners. They're trying to terrorize our forces, break our will to fight." Through the command post window, Collins could see new arrivals being processed. Other survivors from various units, each bearing similar stories. Some had made it out with their whole units intact. Others, like Collins' group, had been forced to make impossible choices. "Your men," the major said quietly, "the ones you had to leave behind. We'll make sure they're remembered properly. Their families will know they died with honor." "Honor," Collins repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "They died because I left them." "They died because the enemy gave you no choice," the major corrected firmly. "Reports are coming in from other units that tried to evacuate all their wounded. None of them made it. Complete losses." He leaned forward. "The hardest part of command isn't making the right choice. It's living with the only choice you had." A commotion outside drew their attention. A jeep had arrived with fresh intelligence reports. The news spread quickly through the command post. Other American units had been completely destroyed, trying to hold their positions. No survivors found. Whole companies wiped out, their bodies discovered frozen in their foxholes or burned in buildings. 10th Infantry Division lost 3 entire companies, an intelligence officer reported. They tried to evacuate everyone during their withdrawal. German armor caught them on the road. No survivors. 7th Armored lost 2 battalions trying to hold St. Vith, another officer added. They wouldn't abandon their wounded. SS troops overran their position last night. The reports continued, each one a variation of the same tragic story. Units that tried to save everyone ended up saving no one. The brutal mathematics of survival during the German offensive became clear. Sometimes leaving people behind was the only way to ensure anyone survived at all. Henderson appeared at the door. "Sir," he said to Collins, "the habitual address now permanent despite their equal rank. They want us to help identify some bodies they recovered from another sector." Collins followed him to a tent set up behind the command post. Inside, rows of bodies lay covered with blankets. An officer was documenting each one, trying to maintain some dignity in death for the fallen soldiers. "These men," the officer explained, pointing to a specific row, "were found in what was left of their aid station. Looks like they were wounded, couldn't be evacuated." Their commanding officer stayed with them. He lifted a blanket, revealing the face of a young lieutenant. They found him still holding his pistol. Looks like he did what he could to ensure the Germans didn't take them alive. Collins stared at the lieutenant's face, seeing in it the same choice he had faced. This officer had made a different decision, to stay with his wounded men, to share their fate. Was that more honorable than Collins' choice to ensure at least some of his men survived? The weight of all these deaths, all these choices, pressed down on him like a physical force. In the distance, artillery fire rumbled continuously, the war grinding on, uncaring about the individual tragedies it created. 3 months passed before Collins saw Noville again. The winter had finally released its grip on the Ardennes, and the German offensive had been pushed back. The 101st Airborne, along with other American units, was tasked with documenting war crimes and locating the remains of soldiers lost during the brutal winter campaign. The village looked different in the early spring light. The snow had melted, revealing the full extent of the destruction. The church where they'd taken shelter still stood, its walls now blackened by fire. The houses were mostly ruins, their shells serving as silent witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded. "Over here," Henderson called out. He hadn't left Collins' side since that night, the shared burden of their decision creating a bond stronger than rank or protocol. They found what remained of the house where they'd left their wounded comrades. The structure had been largely destroyed by the SS troops' flamethrowers, but parts of the cellar were still intact. Inside, they discovered evidence of their friends' final moments. Davidson's dog tags were found near what was left of the entrance, along with spent cartridges from his M1 Garand. He'd clearly kept his word about not being taken alive. Miller's rosary beads were recovered from the ashes, the metal cross warped by intense heat but still recognizable. Of Hayes, they found nothing except his medical tags, the aluminum partially melted. "They fought," Henderson said quietly, examining the evidence. German ammunition casings littered the area around the house, suggesting their wounded comrades had indeed extracted a price from their attackers before the end. The old Belgian, Matthias, had survived the German occupation. They found him tending to the graves of villagers killed during the SS reprisals. Fresh flowers marked each burial site, a small act of remembrance in the face of overwhelming tragedy. "Your friends," Matthias said when he saw them. "I made sure they were remembered too." He led them to a small marker behind the church, where he'd carved their names into a wooden cross. "The Germans burned many bodies, but what we could find, we buried properly." Collins knelt by the marker, touching the rough carved names. "Did they suffer?" he asked, needing to know but dreading the answer. Matthias shook his head. "It was quick. The grenades did their work. The SS found only bodies." He paused. "They died as soldiers, on their own terms. In war, sometimes that is the best we can hope for." Their mission wasn't just about finding remains. They were gathering evidence proof of war crimes committed during the German offensive. Collins and his men testified about what they'd seen, documenting the civilian massacres, the execution of prisoners, the systematic brutality of the SS units. In a bitter irony, their survival had given them the ability to bear witness. Had they stayed with their wounded, had they all died in that house in Noville, these stories might have remained untold, these crimes undocumented. They found more sites like Noville, villages where civilians had been murdered for helping Allied soldiers, locations where wounded Americans had been executed rather than taken prisoner. Each discovery reinforced the horrible truth of their decision that night. The SS had shown no mercy to those who fell into their hands. "You know what I can't stop thinking about?" Romano said as they documented another massacre site. "How many other units faced the same choice we did? How many other commanders had to decide who to leave behind?" The evidence they gathered painted a clear picture. Units that tried to evacuate all their wounded had often been caught and destroyed. Those who made the hardest choice, leaving behind those who couldn't be moved, sometimes survived to fight another day. "We found something else," an investigator told them, holding out a water-damaged notebook. It had been recovered from the ruins of the house where they'd left their wounded. Inside, in Davidson's handwriting, was a final message. "To whoever finds this, we chose this, all of us. Don't let anyone blame Collins. He gave us a chance to choose our end. That's more than most get in this war. Make sure people know what happened here. Make sure it means something." The summer of 1946 found Private First Class Michael Collins standing on a quiet street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The war had been over for nearly a year, but its echoes still haunted him. He clutched a letter in his hand, the first of many he would deliver personally to the families of the men he'd left behind in Noville. The Miller family home was a modest, two-story house with American flags in the windows. Mary Miller, Thomas's mother, answered the door with hope in her eyes that quickly faded when she saw Collins' expression. She'd received the official telegram months ago, but Collins had promised himself he would tell her the whole truth, or at least the version of it that might bring some peace. "Your son," Collins began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands, "wanted you to know he wasn't afraid at the end. The lie tasted better than he'd expected, a mercy like the grenades had been. He died, protecting his fellow soldiers, making sure others could survive to tell his story." In each city he visited, the scene played out similarly. Davidson's wife in Oregon, Hayes' parents in Georgia. Some families welcomed him with open arms, desperate for any additional details about their loved one's final moments. Others could barely stand to look at him, their grief still too raw. Henderson had joined him for some of the visits. "You don't have to do this alone," he'd said. "We all carried the weight of that decision." But Collins knew it had been his choice in the end. His command, his responsibility. The families deserved to hear it from him. During his visit to the Hayes family, he learned that William Hayes had a son born 2 months after his death. The baby would never know his father, but Collins made sure he would know his father's courage. "Your husband's sacrifice saved lives," he told Hayes' widow. "The intelligence we gathered, the evidence we collected after, it helped bring some of the worst war criminals to justice. It wasn't much comfort, but it was something, a meaning attached to the seemingly senseless loss." At night, in anonymous hotel rooms between visits, Collins would reread Davidson's recovered notebook. The water-damaged pages contained not just his final message, but thoughts about the nature of sacrifice, duty, and the impossible choices war forces upon soldiers. "Sometimes survival isn't about being the strongest or the bravest," Davidson had written. "Sometimes it's about being willing to live with the hardest decisions." The war crimes trials in Nuremberg had begun, and evidence gathered by Collins and other survivors helped secure convictions against several SS officers responsible for the massacres in the Ardennes. The Belgian resistance had also kept meticulous records, including details about the civilian deaths in Noville and other villages. Matthias had survived the war's end and turned the small marker behind the church into a proper memorial. Allied commanders ensured the names of the fallen were officially recorded, their sacrifices acknowledged in military records. Romano never went back to Noville, but he kept the radio recordings of that night. "Someone needs to remember," he said. "Someone needs to know what really happened, not just what gets written in the history books." Wilson became a military historian, documenting similar stories from across the European theater cases where commanders had to choose between saving some or losing all. His research revealed their experience in Noville had been far from unique. Countless others had faced the same impossible choice. In 1954, Collins received a letter from Germany. A former Wehrmacht officer had read Wilson's historical account and recognized the events in Noville. He'd been part of a regular army unit that arrived after the SS massacre. "We found the bodies of your men," the officer wrote. "They died as soldiers, fighting to the end. Even the SS spoke of their bravery. I want you to know, you made the right choice. I saw what happened to units that were captured intact. Your men died on their own terms. In war, that is no small thing." The letter brought Collins a measure of peace he hadn't expected. He kept it with Davidson's notebook and Miller's recovered rosary beads, tangible reminders that sometimes the hardest choices are the only ones we have. Years later, when asked about that night in Noville, Collins would simply say, "We think war is about choosing between right and wrong. Sometimes it's about choosing between wrong and more wrong. The trick is learning to live with whichever wrong you choose." The memorial in Noville still stands today. Fresh flowers appear regularly beneath the names of both soldiers and civilians who died there. Among the inscriptions is a line from Davidson's notebook, carved in both English and French. "Sometimes it's better to leave the survivors behind, not because they deserve to be left, but because their story deserves to be told."